Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Doug. I have to say, I don't know if it's the water here or the climate, but I've caught up with a number of good friends from the past, and they don't seem to have aged very much. So there's something about South Australia, perhaps in Adelaide. Actually, it's a beautiful city, Adelaide, and I've been here. This is my third visit. I've never really had a chance to explore the city, but I read a little bit about it yesterday on the plane coming over. They had some pictures there, and I thought it's beautiful and by the sea. And I took a little walk in Happy Valley yesterday afternoon. I actually got myself lost. New Zealand is much smaller. You can't get lost over there. But I got myself lost going around the block. But at one stage I was on a hill and I could see out to the ocean, and I thought, this is gorgeous. It's a gorgeous planet that we live on. I wanted to strut around a little bit, but I'm under strict instructions by the boss back here that I can't walk around, and if I do so he's going to produce a nail gun and nail my feet to the floor. So I'm sorry, I can't do my Elvis act and strut. I haven't got the right hair for it either. Very good comments from you there, Ken, and I think it was a very good summary of the crises or problems in the world as they are at the moment. I mean, crises have always existed, problems have always existed, and it's in reaction to that often we get very good results, because it forces people to produce a reaction. And it is my view that conscious evil exists, and I think part of the problem in the modern world is that we've forgotten that conscious evil exists. It has direction, it has organisation, it has finance behind it. And I think, in my view, I've got a Catholic background, I'm proud of much of that. I don't recall ever having it emphasised that although there was sin talked about, there was never an emphasis on conscious evil, organised conscious evil. And I think that's lacking and has disarmed us in defence, being able to defend good. And so around the world today we can look, no matter what we look at, we can find crisis. I mean, it's not that life is harsh everywhere. To the extent that it's not, we're living on the inheritance of the past. So I come here to a beautiful city. People came from the other side of the world. They built a particular kind of structure here. Your infrastructure, the type of family life, the social organisations that went with that, the developing farms, the same thing happened in New Zealand. And we are beneficiaries of all that. And that goes back in history a long way. All that knowledge and all that experience and the intuition that came with it and everything else, and we still benefit from that. But nevertheless, our societies are in terrible crisis, and we are betrayed left, right and centre. We're betrayed by the politicians, and I think we've been betrayed by the clergy, which isn't to say that there aren't individuals that have been heroic, but very few of them. We've elected a number of politicians in New Zealand at times that you wouldn't have this happen here. Before the election, they're going to do this, that, and the other thing. Once they're there, that's the last of it. In fact, they very often do the opposite. And I'm going to come back to that. I want to dig a little deeper into this thing of conscious evil and the effects it had. And it is the opposite of good. And it manifests itself in every facet of existence, at the spiritual level and the physical level. We have movements, they're called movements, but really they're just creations of the media and really out of the so-called higher learnings of institution, like the LGBT, QMSR, whatever movement. And usually some very sad individuals. There's a suspicion that the same little group is aeroplaned around different parts of the world to provide protests. Much media attention is given to this, and there's much talk about rights, but really, to me, that type of movement and movements claiming that abortion is all about a woman's right and it's for helping women, and euthanasia is for helping people, and we must be a caring society, all these things are presented in a way to make them seem good, but they are outrageously evil. They destroy human beings, they destroy families, they destroy community, they destroy nations, they undermine at every level. The LGBT movement wants access to small children, even pre-aged children, because these children have rights, and they have the right to decide what gender they're going to be that day or that hour of the day, because you can change. You can change from one to the other. You can be a sheep in the morning and a cow at night, and a woman then and a boy then. The only answer to that is a connection to truth. And I think that takes us back to a re-examination of what Christ was about. And the message, when I look at it, that Christ gave us was really a very simple message. And it can be encompassed in the word love. And what he taught about God was that God loves us. And as I see it, I think one of the problems is the human mind, when it goes astray, complicates things that aren't really understandable when they've been complicated. They only understand them simply. So if Christ said we can't go to that higher place without being like a small child, to me that's like a small child. I'm not sure how much I can move here without getting my feet nailed to the ground. When a small child looks at their parents, they basically see God. Mum knows everything, Dad knows everything. I don't know if any of you experienced it, I'm sure you did. When you get to an age and you think, heck, my father didn't actually know everything. My mother didn't know everything. We can compare things. But when you're little, and Christ said, unless we're little children, so a little child does not question, even when the parent does something bad, they do not question it. Human beings are frail, even parents, and fallible. But when he said, unless we become like little children, to me that's the attitude of that little child of total trust in the adult that's been put there to care for them, unquestioningly. And if that's the attitude we're supposed to have towards God, it tells us something about God. And Christ gave us some other leads on what God was about. One was a loving father. We could say a king, a protector, a guide, all those things. And I think there's something else that is absolutely vital, and that is that he's also a servant. And what is the purpose of prayer is to ask God to do things for us. And I think that's an absolutely awesome thing. It's an incredible revelation. Because Christ himself said to his apostles, he who would be the greatest among you would be the greatest of all. Or words to that effect. I'm no Bible scholar. I don't want to be. But if we pray to God, if God is such that he loves us and we can ask him for favours, he's actually our servant. I think that's an absolutely important thing that has to be borne into account. And the whole coming of Christ established. I picked up a book this morning at Arnie's place. I feel like stealing it, but I haven't yet. It's a Rudolf Steiner book, and I just hadn't opened it at a page. It's a series of lectures he gave, and he was saying there that the pre-Christ man, and he mentions Socrates, as opposed to the post-Christ man, automatically had a different view of the world. Something had been revealed that changed everything. A few things were lost, and much more gained. So we can't think like someone did 2,500 years ago, because something happened in our world, and I think that was the coming of Christ and what he revealed about what God actually was. And in the world that flowed from that, we can understand truth to a very large extent. Our lives are spent searching and discovering and learning, and we learn from mistakes, but nevertheless we can have a fairly good idea, if we're humble enough, of what we can call truth and the power of love. And really, anything that is in opposition to that is satanic, whether we name it as liberalism or a false freedom, it's satanic. And C.H. Douglas referred to this too, and there's a Latin term for it, which I don't know, but the devil is God upside down. So if God created the sexes, man, woman, parent, child, He created all those things, and we're being told that you can change your sex. It's just all up here. It's just a social conditioning. I actually know someone who tried to raise her daughter with no dolls, no girly things. She didn't dress her like Pierre Trudeau's silly son in Canada dresses little boy in girls' clothes and parade him in public. He said he had the boy's permission. I think the boy's 3 or 4 year old or something. He had his permission. Within 2 or 3 years, the mother of this child, because she was a loving mother, but she didn't want the daughter to grow up with preconceived ideas that she was only feminine. She felt very guilty, the mother, and made sure that the kiddie had lots of dolls and stuff after that. So she learnt from that. But there was something weird going on there that any mother would even think like that in the first place. But at least she learnt something from it, and I think felt a little bit guilty about that. And laughed about her own stupidity, which is something we need to do sometimes. So life teaches us lessons, and hopefully we'll learn something about that. So we live in a world where it often seems that evil now is in the ascendant. But evil has the ingredients of its own destruction. Eric Butler used to say that, and I agree totally with him. Actually, talking about Eric, when you quoted something from Socrates, Eric did used to say that, but he said Socrates was dead, so he couldn't contradict him. I have the fondest memories of Eric Butler, and none of us would be here without him, so I'm very conscious of that. And I'm conscious of a man who I admired greatly, and that was Frank Borden, who was here in South Australia, and I have the fondest memories of Frank. I even remember him falling asleep, and I was astounded that he could fall asleep and hold a glass of tea, a cup of tea or a glass of beer, and not spill it and wake up again after a while and drink it. I think it took a lot of skill. And staying overnight at his place here, and he laughed. He took me into his home. His wife was deceased then, and who I never met, and he took me into his home and he laughed. And then I realised what he was laughing. There wasn't a spare seat in the house that wasn't covered in almonds. So he said, you can sleep anywhere, you just have to clear the almonds off one of the beds. In the world in which we live now, particularly in the West, where liberalism, Satanism, call it what you like, opposition to truth exists, we live in a world of lies and deceit, and the medium whereby that is able to happen is the mass media. Which doesn't mean that every journalist there's some really good journalists. They usually have to leave the big media and work in the internet to get their stories across, if they can afford to do that. But the mass media tells us endless lies and has cut us off from a rich heritage, us Europeans and others, from anything that's beneficial from our heritage from the past. Constitutional, cultural, social, all the institutions. I have a friend, and it's funny how her little experiences have such a deep meaning. She has on her shelving some lovely little statues, ornaments. And I said, what is that? And she said, well, that's a journeyman. And I said, yeah, I work as a carpenter. I said, a journeyman, yeah, I'm not sure what that actually is. I've since looked it up on the internet to learn a little bit more, and she came from Europe, this lady. And she said, well, a journeyman was a young man, who started his apprenticeship, whether in baking or bricklaying or carpentry or stonework. And when he got to a certain level of expertise, he then went on a journey with a letter from his employer and anyone else, and it was a letter stating that he had achieved a certain amount of confidence and competence in his trade, and he would go off to another town, maybe close by, maybe a long way away. And so he was a journeyman, and he would present this, and this way he could build up his skills. And I thought, what a wonderful way that we had in doing that. We still keep the apprenticeship system. They tried to ban it not ban it, but abolish it in New Zealand a few years ago in the building trade, and we ended up with a bit of a mess. So it kind of got brought back, even with a little bit of government subsidy. So there's a lesson for our politicians in that as well. But this is all part of a rich heritage which we are largely cut off from. And it's only independent organisations and a few brave individuals that hold on to that past and tell everybody else that is absolutely important. It's a religious heritage, cultural, moral and social. And the mass media, I believe, it appears anyway, that one of its functions is to keep the world in a state of crisis, keep us in a state of crisis. There's earthquakes here, and much of what they say is correct, but there's never any background. There's a war over here. How much has your mass media told you about the background to the war in Syria? I hear people regularly, work colleagues, saying to me, they're all mad in that part of the world. They're always fighting. That's all they do in that part of the world in the Middle East. They just fight. There's no background. And it does appear, if you just watch the spoon-fed news, you come up with, they're just mad on that part of the world. But where did the money come from? Where did the armaments come from? Where was their planning? There's always planning in these things. And the media appears to me not necessarily always to tell the entire falsehood about everything, make up lies. They give you little pictures. But there's a whole picture that's that big, not just that big. And so the media plays the role of protecting a higher power which rules, and that is in finance. And their job seems to be to distract us away from that always, and distract us away from any programs that order wants to bring about, which is the world state, really, if they can. And it has achieved a great deal of success, largely, I think, because Christianity declined and went into reverse. Organised Christianity, and I think we forgot, to a large extent, the simplicity of the actual story of Christianity. And I think we have to remind ourselves of that and of basic truths, and we have to be aware of it, and we have to be inspired by that. And inspired that at one time, this faith, this belief system, based on truth, actually built an entire civilization. The fact that it could do it then, it'll do it again now. We've all lived in an age when there was this threat of a new world order. And I think most of you are probably aware of what I mean by that. A program to destroy nationhood, and in the process of destroying nationhood, you've got to destroy community and families, and all the social structure and the heritage of those people, particularly in the Christian world, or formerly Christian world. But my own view is that it will never happen. The attempt to make it happen causes disaster. But has Christianity been destroyed? And I don't think so. Because quite often it's interesting that in a crisis, some people find a strength to deal with that crisis. Whether it's a natural disaster or a man-made disaster, it doesn't make any difference. In a crisis, it's amazing how many people who otherwise just led ordinary, everyday lives will turn out to be leaders, fantastic ideas, tremendous amounts of charity for helping others, and that all comes to the fore sometimes when there's a crisis. We had the big earthquake in Christchurch a few years ago, and sometime after that there was an article in one of the papers, the Christchurch paper, by an American chap with a Japanese name, and he said he'd watched what people did when there was crisis, and he referred to the Christchurch earthquake, how people reacted, and the earlier crisis of what's called the nuclear 3 Mile Island nuclear disaster in America or something, where there was a threat of a nuclear explosion at a power station. And he said it's good for people to be prepared for crises, but when he looked at those two examples, and I'm not sure if it would happen the same in all around the world, in different parts of the world, but certainly in these two cases, if people were encouraged in cases of crisis in the future to keep a certain amount of fresh water at home, some food and stuff like that, he said those people that had made those provisions simply didn't have it the next day because they'd shared it with everybody. As soon as people realised their families were okay, they went to the neighbours to see if they were okay. They sent other family members out to check if Mrs. So-and-so was all right. It was tremendous community spirit. I found that very inspiring, that this man had observed this, and this is what people did in crisis. No one was thinking about their mortgages or anything else. They just wanted to know that their neighbours and others were all right. And in that I find great hope, because it means that no matter what somebody's belief system is, by and large the majority of people respond to decency and act decently under certain circumstances. And that is why I think what Christ taught is correct, and it fits in with human nature, the true aspects of human nature. And why in a crisis people develop something inside themselves to deal with that crisis, and it brings out the best. And that is why when I look around the world at the moment, the reaction against liberalism, Satanism, is a large number of Christian lay people are doing a lot, and it's even encouraging some of the clergy to step forward and do something as well. So I'll just pick within the Catholic Church, but I know it's happening elsewhere as well. I read a website called LifeSite News. It comes from North America, Canada, the United States, and it's Catholic lay people, but not only Catholics participate in it and write. They've done a lot to help expose the current crisis in the Catholic Church, the homosexual problem with the clergy, and exposing the cover-ups that have happened there and the harm done to children, the harm done to young men and others. And the clergy haven't done it. But here and there a few clergy have stepped forward and said, yes, this is correct. So with that exposure, some have come forward and broken ranks with obeying the bishop and everything and said, yes, this bishop has done that, and every time there's been an incident he's moved the priest sideways to another place. And I find that this requires courage and dedication and a longer term view of things than just protecting my own nest at the time. And I think there is a great deal still of that basic decency and Christianity in ordinary people in the West. It's lacked leadership, but in the crisis of today there appears to be here and there beginnings of a renewal of genuine Christian leadership, and perhaps a renewal of a deeper appreciation of the simplicity of the story of Christianity. And in that vein I want to mention Russia. And I was not aware until quite recently, 2-3 years ago, of the enormous return to Christianity in Russia. It's massive. And of course, organised Christianity has always had infighting and dealing with heresies and whatever, but it's massive. And I was stunned to read 2 or 3 years ago that for about 20 years there's been a new church built every day in Russia. Now, just having churches alone is not necessarily a revival of Christianity, but it can't be denied that at the background of that, it wouldn't happen unless there was some type of revival. I saw a statistic recently, and it was that a survey done about the year 2000 amongst Russian military personnel showed that 33% or something like that identified as Orthodox Christians. Now it's about 87%. Not necessarily churchgoers, but they've connected to something that they think is important, and events within their country and within the world have obviously made many people think about something which they perhaps didn't think about before and which they were cut off from. I was talking to Steve here out in the hallway there just before we started, and we got talking about Jeremy Lee saying years ago, speaking in Adelaide and elsewhere, he actually wrote an article, I think, Jeremy, on how did they build those churches or those cathedrals. So he was talking about buildings of the Middle Ages that we couldn't build now. It's not that we couldn't technically build them, we just haven't got the oomph and the finance and the organisation to actually do that. or the spirit within ourselves to do it. And recently, I read a site called Russia Insider, and started by an American man who was familiar with the Russian scene, a Christian man, pretty bright and gutsy sort of a bloke, and he felt that the Americans and people of the West had the right to have a better understanding of developments in that part of the world, and not just get the lies through the mass media. But in one of the articles on this site was about a church that had been built recently, I've only read this year, in Moscow, and when I looked at it, it looked like a Middle Ages building. And Jeremy used to say, when he wrote, how did they build those structures back then, what inspired them, the beautiful artwork, and research showed that a lot of the work was done voluntarily. And there, reading this article, there was a local art school nearby, and the students and the tutors from the art school did most of the beautiful work inside the church. And it's ornate, it's absolutely beautiful, it looks like something out of the Middle Ages. For a society to be able to produce something like that indicates a spiritual change from where it was, say, 50 years ago. And I find great hope in that. Politically, we've seen so much devastation in our time, and even from the year 2000, we've seen whole countries smashed to pieces militarily. Libya, Iraq, all on pretense, all on lies and misinformation. And we're constantly told misinformation, and that seems to me to be the role that the modern media play in order to protect some higher power above it, which I believe is basically based on banking, the modern fraud of modern banking. Whatever past connections there have been between Russia or the Orthodox Church and Syria, there definitely have been some connections, association, and it seems from what little I've been able to find that the Orthodox Church, the gradually reviving Orthodox Church in Russia, was one of the, and some pressures that it put, or requests it put to the Russian government, was one of the reasons the Russians have gone there and basically put a stop to the total smashing of that, because it would have been totally smashed. If we look at the smashing of Libya a few years before that, not too long ago, they had no opposition. So fighter aircraft, fighter bombers went along large canals. They had tremendous infrastructure. That whatever one thinks of Gaddafi, they had a tremendous infrastructure. They were developing systems that could transport water, massive amounts of underground water they had in one part of the country to another area that for farming, close to where people lived, and they developed a massive infrastructure. Roading, buildings, electrical plants, mostly built by European companies. They had this. Fighter bombers went for miles along canals carrying water and pipelines, dropping bombs. It wasn't to knock out the use of that infrastructure for a period of time. They actually, at a scene, they actually wanted to destroy the actual infrastructure. 10, 20, 30 years of hard work. This is just wanton, appalling destruction, the harm it does to people, and of course then we end up with a refugee crisis with people unable to stay in Syria and Libya, and then they can be pushed into Europe to further weaken Europe as an entity. I just find this appalling, and that's why I say I believe that there's a conscious motive behind evil at a certain level. I do not believe that these things just happen as a result of mistakes, or I want my way this week so I'm going to beat some country up. I think there's more to it than that. It is war against truth at every level. So the Russians have gone into Syria, and largely they prevented the total destruction of Syria. Syria, if there had been no military opposition capable of being a threat to the attacking forces, I think Syria would have gone the same way as Libya quite some time ago. And other places, Iraq. So Russia's return to Christianity, with lots of ups and downs, as there always is in human affairs, is evidence that God isn't dead and that truth isn't dead, and eventually truth can come to the fore. And I'm absolutely convinced that in the West, no matter how bad things may appear to be, from the perspective of somebody who's capable of thinking outside the square, there is also hope, and that is a return to truth. And the crisis itself forces us to say, hey, we have actually gone down the wrong road here. We've gone down that road, we really should be going up that road over there. And now we're getting the results of going down that road, which seemed quite nice at the time, because evil's always presented as being a nice thing to do, free sex and whatever, and what does that do for raising families? And it doesn't do much at all. It's created more problems, but it's created a crisis which then is a kind of a learning experience. So bad as it may seem, and I don't know if we will save our countries. I don't know, I hope we do. But we're betrayed at every level, but the crisis that has emerged can gel us and gel increasing numbers of people, and I believe there is already a wonderful reaction to that. I want to mention something to do with children. I don't have children of my own. I'm an uncle. I have lots of nieces and nephews, and I have some great-grandchildren, and my hair suggests that I may be of that age where I have that. But I think we learn a lot from children. And a little while ago, I was staying with a friend who's got some small children, ranging in ages, and her son has had holidays with me, the little fellow, and it's good company. Anyway, I was sleeping on a mattress on the floor in his room, but when I went to go to bed on this particular night, his oldest sister, so he's 8, I think, and she's 9, and her friend who was visiting were all crowded into the room, and I thought, oh no, I actually just want to go to bed. But then they said, oh, can we borrow your phone? I said, no, you're not having my phone at 9 o'clock at night. Oh, we won't do it for long. We just want to finish the game we started, and Mum won't give us her phone, whatever. You probably don't have children that want all these gadgets in Australia, but it's big time in New Zealand. So I said, no, it's bedtime, whatever. So then I thought, we might as well tell a couple of stories. And I said, do you know what people might have used to do before all this technology was available? I said, it's not very long ago when we didn't even have radios. Have you any idea what people did at night time? And this time of night, no, it must have been boring sort of thing. I said, well, they told stories, and often houses had a piano and they played some music and people would sing, and you'd go over to the neighbours and do things like that as well, do the same thing. Oh, tell us a story. So I told a story, bit of baloney really, and it actually went on, and then they told a little bit of a story, and I told a story, and they said, oh, that's not really true. And I said, well, it's a yarn. So what's a yarn? Well, I said it's when adults tell children something that's not quite true. But it sounds good at the time. And next thing, it was midnight, and a couple of them had gone to sleep, and one of them was still awake, the visiting girl. And I thought, children are they want attention and they want to learn. Youth, I've talked to youth. I've gone for a walk around the street, and one night I met some youth and stopped and talked to them, and it was fascinating. They were very well behaved, probably the latter years of school or just after, and very respectful. And I realised they actually wanted to listen to what I had to say. I was struggling to think of things to say to them, but we sort of managed something. And the little girl that was still awake, eventually they'd crawled into the other end of my bed, and I wanted some peace. So I went and slept on the couch at that place. This little girl said, oh, can we have more stories? And I said, well, it's midnight. No, and the others have gone to sleep. We must go. And there'd been a wee incident earlier in the day, and I'd gone mad at one of the kids, and this visiting kid said she didn't like that. And I said, well, yeah, I did sort of lose it a little bit. And but I said, I love these kids. I've known them since they were little wee tots and that. And she says, oh, well, you love me too. Kids are very innocent. And I think storytelling was a very important thing of the past. It connected existing generations with past generations. It involved mythology, not necessarily true, like the story of Robin Hood. To me, he's the archetypal English hero. And we love hearing that story because he's the ideal hero. He's He's saving people. He's putting his life on the line. It's what we all think of as a hero. It's what we all think that we would do ourselves or like to do ourselves in that position. And so to me, he's the archetypal English hero. It's what an Englishman and an Englishwoman looks to for protection and guidance, and somebody with leadership qualities. So I'm going to conclude in a minute, but that brings me to a subject I think is really important, and I think it's something that has to be restored in our societies if our societies are going to survive and grow, and that is manhood. I won't dare talk about womanhood. I couldn't do it.
What do you know about?
I don't know anything about it. It's a total mystery. I was introduced to a group some years ago which I think did some very good work, and in going to one of the meetings, it was called Mankind Project. I don't know if any of you have come about it. I knew nothing about it. I happened to be doing some carpentry in someone's house. I was there a moment at lunchtime. I picked up a brochure to read, and it was about this organisation. So I'm not pushing the organisation, but I had a very good experience with it, and I learned a great deal. And one of the things was a young man growing up, a boy growing up in a sane society needs to be able to move from boyhood to manhood, and there needs to be something. Some societies have a ritual, but some recognition. And it reminded me of an old Englishman telling me one time that when he reached the age of, I don't know if it was 13 or 14, something like that, he'd always desperately wanted to go out with his dad and his dad's friend on the little fishing boat. They'd go out in the river and they'd fish, and he wanted to do it. And one day, one of the adults said, "Come on, lad, you're coming with us." So he set out on the boat. There he was. He started talking about something that had happened at school that week, and one of these men, not his father, pats him on the shoulder and says, "You're a man now. We don't talk about what happens during the week." And he said that changed his world. So how many boys never get an experience like that where they're brought into manhood? And much of what that organisation was doing was recognising that need and trying to cater for it to some extent. But it's something that, I'm not saying I didn't get it or whatever. I grew up on a farm. I had some pretty good experiences, and as about an 8 or 9 year old, you're told to go and plough a paddock or pick up the hay or something like that. And I think maybe there's some advantages in growing up in the countryside, but it's lacking. And it's just one of the things, and I think it's lacking largely because of a breakdown in society in general, and miseducation, and so many boys growing up without dads. There's some wonderful movements. What do we call it? Big Buddy. I don't know if it's a worldwide group or whatever, but Big Buddy in New Zealand, where they team up a responsible man, with a boy who's fatherless. And I think this type of thing is fantastic. It cannot replace the total breakdown of the family that we see, but it's a good help, and it helps the older man to grow, and it helps the boy in so many ways. And I think stuff like this has to again flourish, and we have to, for want of a better term, return to some of the values of the past and the wisdom of the past as well. The liberal mind will say, "Oh, you want to take us back to the bad old days, the Middle Ages," or something like that. I had a meal in a restaurant a few days ago, a couple of weeks ago, and I got talking to a young man, a new waiter there, and he said he was Russian. And I said, "I'm very interested in Russia. I'd like to go for a visit there. I'm very interested in all these new churches they're building." The response was, "It's horrible. I don't want to ever go back there. The people running the place want to return us to the Middle Ages." So I thought, well, if that's how you see it, that's how you see it. I did comment that I thought that was a good thing. So I'll conclude in that, just re-emphasising that crisis, whether it's personal crisis or it's a broader social crisis, I think offers the opportunity for reaction against that, and that reaction has to be a return to truth, because anything else is just a total failure. Thank you.
Okay, when I was at school, I studied a book in secondary school, One Day in the Life of Elizabeth, which is by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And so I was quite intrigued with him. So the question I've got for you, with this regeneration of Christendom in Russia, do you see a connection with Solzhenitsyn?
I see a very big connection with Solzhenitsyn. Every society needs heroes, and I think Solzhenitsyn is one of those heroes that has perhaps been an inspiration to the regeneration in Russia. And Solzhenitsyn was widely read in the West in earlier times, but I doubt that he's even hardly heard of by many people today. But there's something about his writings that is just stirring. I've read that book, and I've read, is it called The Inner Circle? It's to do with the life inside one of the Soviet labour camps. And just in the description of the personalities, what's going on in the different people's minds is fascinating. The human spirit doesn't die, even in those sort of circumstances. And somehow Solzhenitsyn draws this out, and I agree with you. I think Solzhenitsyn will be spoken about in 500 years' time.
Have they officially adopted Christianity into their institutions and that type of thing?
I don't know, but I don't even know if that's necessary. They do acknowledge that Orthodox Christianity was, without that there would never have been a Russia. That seems to come through quite strongly. And there's some wonderful stories of soldier saints, including a female, in the early days of the founding of Russia, because Orthodox Christianity had been destroyed in Constantinople, virtually, and it rose up again around with the Russians, and always fighting among themselves, and then gradually, with the conversion and deepening of Orthodox Christianity, they built a whole nation out of that. It's an amazing story. I know so little about it. I've just been learning a little bit in recent times, and the same as in the West. It's those small number of heroes who are able to climb above themselves and connect to the Godhead, learn to be forgiving, but also growing strong at the same time. That seems to have built the East and the West, in my view.
Bill, you said about the media really don't quite tell us the whole story. They've got a higher authority. And I'm thinking about when you're looking around in the real world, our physical attributes, they're wonderful, and yet when we look at the bookkeeping side of it, all those wonderful things are registered as debt. I wonder whether you might just comment on that.
This article I wrote earlier in the year was in response to another article that was in Russia Insider by a businessman in Russia, successful businessman, but a very strong Christian, actually a Georgian. And he was criticising the role of Russia's central bank, and he was implying that Russia, although it had regained much of its sovereignty as a nation, it had not expressed sovereignty over and control over its banking system. And the whole role of central banking appeared to keep the Russian financial system tied to the way the rest of the world's financial system operated, and connected to the Bank of International Settlements and all this stuff. So he was saying, unless we're freed from that, we're not really a sovereign country. So this inspired me. So I put pen to paper, so to speak, and he published my article. And what you're saying is that the financial system is not in keeping with the real world. So in my view, God made the real world and the enormous physical wealth that contains. So in a nation like Russia, where they have no shortage of oil, no shortage of farmland, no shortage of infrastructure for providing all the things that they need, it's probably one of the richest countries in the world, mineral-wise. The United States has a great array of minerals. Australia does too, but for modern industry you need a very wide range, and Russia is one of the few places that has just about everything it needs. So why should sanctions against Russia stop the Russians from having a very good standard of living? And it shouldn't. Only wrongful thinking about the nature of money is the obstacle to that. So if God made the universe and our earth and put enormous amounts of natural wealth there, and we say we can't get access to that unless we can export about 3/4 or so of what we produce, and there's a shortage of money, it means we don't understand the nature of money and we don't understand the nature of the all-giving God. And by not understanding the nature of money, we are totally manipulated by those that do understand it and do use it for evil. So in God's world, we can't go into debt. A properly functioning money system, which is only a numbering or accounting system, should reflect the proper natural physical universe. So if you can't go into debt physically, which I mean, if there's a shortage of wheat this year, you can't pilfer some from next year's crop. It just doesn't happen. We can't physically do that. So we can't go into debt. An individual may be in debt to another person. And the nature of money is that it is a numbering system, it's a counting system, at the most it's a counting system, and it is a means for distributing what has been produced within a nation, within the world. To say that a village or a town can't build a bridge across the water because there's no money, but the materials are all there to do it, or easily obtained, and the labour's there to do it, and the skills are there to do it, and the need is there to do it, it's actually insanity. And so in this respect, the world is insane, right across. Because we've elevated money into something it isn't. I use the example of a man on a desert island. He can't find any fresh water, and he's absolutely dying. And if he was told you can have a glass of water, or you can have all the money in the world, you can have $1 million, you can have $1 billion, we'll deliver it to you in checks, notes, coins, gold, silver, anything else you want, we'll bring that to you. And he says, I want a glass of water. Why is that? Because water is real wealth. All the other stuff isn't real wealth. It's a way of measuring real wealth and distributing real wealth and accounting for the different aspects of a functioning economy. Water is wealth, like this here, and this here, and the chair we sit on. But money is not real wealth, and until we get our minds around that, but Oliver's going to save the world by teaching it about this. Until we get around that mental block, we're not going to solve too many of our bigger problems. We can solve perhaps some of the smaller problems. It's my hope that as Christianity rises again, and I believe it is already started and is going to, these aspects will emerge a little bit more into the clearer light. Truth has a way of hiding sometimes, or we blind ourselves from it, but as we open our eyes to certain things, we may hopefully open our eyes to this as well.
Bill, I just recently read a foreword to something by a bloke called Robinson, and in the foreword it was in regard to the function of a gun is to fire, and the function of the financial system is to generate debt. And I happened to be looking at the bloke who wrote the foreword to it. It was a very good booklet by Michael Lane, Human Ecology and Social Credit. And I wonder if you care to just close that out, because I find it fascinating. You're bringing us right to the edge. And the thing is, the way I read the financial system is its purpose, its function, is to create debt. And we see that in the world debt. And it has no other purpose. It's not about distribution. It's about power and creating debt, that we can't actually have what we have right in front of us unless we incur further debt.
I don't know what to add to that. I'd forgotten I'd even written that forward many years ago to Michael's book, and a couple of others that he did. But I think you summed it up very well, Arnie. But that is not, when we talk about the money system, and when you're talking about the money system, you're talking about as it operates at the moment. But it's only a numbering system, it's only an accounting system, and it doesn't have to operate like that. The wonderful insight of Clifford Douglas, the English-Scottish engineer, in that period during and after the First World War, where he devoted the rest of his life to revealing what is the real nature of money. Others have done it, but I think Douglas did it in the most clear way, and I think it was because he was an engineer. He hadn't been trained as an economist. He looked at economics from an engineer's point of view. We'd be looking at a lathe over here that's not functioning right. It's all out of balance or something. And so an engineer would look at that and say, well, it needs a new bearing and it needs this and it needs something else and the part's broken over there. We'll put that back together and we'll get it working right. So he looked at the financial system and how it ought to function in order to serve industry, the production system, and consumers. And he looked at how it should function as opposed to how it was functioning. And not being a Marxist revolutionary, he was a conservative British individual, very clever, very humble, and able to look at something and say, this is a problem and it can be solved. It's a man-made problem. Whether it's a deliberate problem or it's a mistake, didn't really matter in the end. He said we can do this and this and this and this to make the financial system do its job properly, because its proper job is to facilitate the finance, the numbers that the production system needs in order to produce, and to ensure that that production matches what the consumers want and the consumers can consume it. And in doing that, of course, it was brought to his attention, his realisation in due course, that the problem was understood in certain circles and was going to be exploited, was already exploited and was going to be exploited. And then he realised it wasn't just a matter of fixing the financial system, you had to deal with the whole philosophy of freedom and centralised power as opposed to decentralised power, because the exploitation of the debt that's imposed on society, and which oppresses society, allows a group of people, largely hidden, to exercise enormous power. And power entraps people. If your outlook on life is that, well, people are just sophisticated animals at the most, we'll treat them kindly at the most, but if they get in their way, we'll knock them out of the way, because we believe the best way to run society is for an elite to rule and have total power. And we want that power. I want it, I want it, I want it. Unlike Christ when he was taken up into the high mountain or something in the desert there and tempted with power, he rejected it. And we ought to follow that example. I mean, we all have the capacity within us to think, wow, if only I had the power. Fortunately, most of us haven't got that to rule over others and do harm to others if they won't fit into how we think things should be done. But when you've got a group that have worked for a very long time and totally believe that they're chosen to do that, and keep convincing themselves they've got the right to do it and this is the way to go, then that creates, and they've got the power via the debt money system, that creates a major obstacle which we have to overcome. But largely we have to overcome it not by destroying those people, but by destroying that tool that they've got, which is the financial system and the media which protects it. I believe those two things work hand in hand.